"I will not allow this bridge to open." That's what the President of the United States said about a bridge his own country never paid $1 to build. 6 months later, he took credit for opening it anyway and called it a much better deal. I'm Connor Mackenzie, and this is Canada Plus 24. If you want the stories that connect Canada, the United States, and the money moving between them, subscribe now, because this one has a twist in the fine print that even the outlets covering it almost missed. Let's start with the number both governments agree on, 6.4 billion Canadian dollars. That is what Canada spent, alone, to build the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a 6-lane, cable-stayed crossing linking Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, with a main span of 853 meters, the longest of its kind in North America. Construction started in 2018. The United States did not contribute a cent to building it. Not to the towers, not to the deck, not to the port of entry on the Canadian side. Canada financed it, Canada built it, and under the deal signed back in 2012. The year the crossing was formally agreed between the two countries, 3 years before it was even named after the Detroit Red Wings legend. Canada was supposed to keep every dollar of toll revenue until that $6.4 billion was fully paid back. Here's the part almost nobody reported clearly. Even under that original 2012 agreement, Canada was never going to keep everything forever. Once the debt was cleared, profits were always going to split 50-50 with Michigan. The catch was timing. Engineers projected that full repayment could take at least 50 years. 50 years of Canada collecting tolls before a single American entity saw a cent of profit. That was the deal both governments signed off on under 2 different American presidents, including Donald Trump himself, who called the bridge a vital economic link between the two countries in a joint statement with Justin Trudeau back in 2017. So hold that number in your head, 50 years. Because everything that happened next was about shrinking it, and about who benefits when it shrinks. This bridge also has a longer, messier history than most of the coverage let on. Opposition to it goes back to the early 2000s, when the idea of a second public crossing between Windsor and Detroit was first floated. The reason it took until 2018 to break ground wasn't engineering, it was litigation. The Ambassador Bridge, a nearly century-old, privately owned toll crossing sitting 2 miles downstream, has handled the bulk of Detroit-Windsor commercial traffic for generations. It's owned by the Moran family, and its billionaire patriarch, Manuel Moran, spent years suing to block the Gordie Howe project outright, arguing a public competitor would undercut his own toll revenue. He lost those fights, construction eventually began, and Canada. Since American federal funding never materialized despite years of discussion, committed to financing the entire project itself, structured as a partnership between a Canadian Crown Corporation, the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, and an international authority with equal representation from Canada and Michigan overseeing it. By February of 2026, the bridge was finished and undergoing testing, with a ribbon cutting expected within months. Then, on a Monday night, Trump posted a lengthy rant on Truth Social that changed everything. "I will not allow this bridge to open until the United States is fully compensated for everything we have given them," he wrote, adding that Canada needed to treat America with the fairness and respect that we deserve. He claimed the bridge was built with virtually no U.S. content, and that Canada owned both sides outright. Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkens and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's office both said that was false. American steel and American union labor were used on the Michigan side approach and the U.S. port of entry the entire time. CNN's fact-checkers confirmed the claim didn't hold up, noting some of Trump's specific talking points echoed arguments the Moran family itself had made for years, including in a 2018 television ad that ran on a network Trump was known to watch. Then Trump said something even stranger. He warned that if Canada moved ahead with closer trade ties to China, the first thing China will do is terminate all ice hockey being played in Canada and permanently eliminate the Stanley Cup. No explanation was offered for how that would work, because there isn't one. Mayor Dilkens called the entire outburst insane, saying, "I really can't believe what I'm reading." Michigan Senator Gary Peters called the claims completely backwards, and Congresswoman Debbie Dingell pointed out the bridge had been negotiated by a Republican governor and endorsed by Trump himself back in 2017. But underneath the noise about hockey and steel content was a very specific, very serious demand. Trump's trade representative, Jamieson Greer, laid it out plainly in a Fox Business interview. The United States wanted a negotiation specific to the bridge, and because the American economy dwarfs Canada's, Greer argued the U.S. deserved a bigger cut of the proceeds. regardless of who actually paid to build it. The United States needs to make sure it has its fair share of any proceeds from that bridge and the economic activity that it generates, he said. Trump went further, floating the idea that the U.S. should simply own at least one half of the bridge outright, an asset it had contributed nothing to construct. Now here's where the story gets a name attached to it. The New York Times reported that Matthew Maroon, chairman of the company that owns the Ambassador Bridge, met with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick hours before Trump's February outburst. Reporting also confirmed the Maroon family had donated $1 million to a pro-Trump campaign group. The U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, publicly denied any connection between those donations and the bridge delay when pressed on it directly. Make of the timing what you will, but every month the Gordie Howe Bridge stayed closed was another month of traffic and toll revenue, staying on the Ambassador Bridge instead. Currently, around 40,000 vehicles a day cross the Ambassador Bridge. Even a modest diversion of that traffic once Gordie Howe opens represents a meaningful hit to a competitor's bottom line. Prime Minister Mark Carney's response is worth noting too. He said publicly that he spoke to Trump directly and told him Canadians paid for this bridge in full and that Americans already had an ownership stake through the joint authority governing it. That should have settled the argument. It didn't. Negotiations dragged on through the spring alongside a parallel, higher stakes conversation. The Canada-U.S. Mexico Trade Agreement, CUSMA, was approaching its own scheduled review deadline of July 1st, 2026. Carney raised the bridge and CUSMA in the same phone calls, because by this point, neither government was treating them as separate issues. The bridge, fully built and structurally ready for traffic on both sides of the border, sat closed anyway. A June 12th opening was pushed back, with officials citing the need to resolve outstanding issues. Mayor Dilkins was blunter about it publicly. Both interstate systems were ready. The delay was political, not technical. The bridge had already become a live issue in Michigan's closely watched U.S. Senate race, with Republican candidate Mike Rogers referencing ongoing conversations with Commerce Secretary Lutnick on local radio, while Democratic candidate Mallory McMorrow tried, before dropping out of the race, to turn the delay into a political liability for Republicans. That agreement finally came in mid-July. On July 11th, Canadian officials confirmed a deal had been reached. The bridge would open July 27th. Trump posted almost immediately, calling it a much better deal for America and thanking the Canadian government by name. The original deal made was unacceptable to me, he wrote. The new deal is great and fair. Thank you and congratulations to the Canadian government. So what actually changed? Here is the number that should matter to you more than any social media post. For the next 15 years, Canada and the United States will split net toll profits 50-50, funneled through a U.S.-run Regional Economic Development Fund, not after Canada recovers its $6.4 billion. Starting immediately. The 50-year runway Canada was counting on to pay itself back just got longer, because half of what would have gone toward that debt is now being redirected from day one of operations. And here is the detail that separates a careful analysis from a headline. The word doing all the work in this deal is net. Prime Minister Carney told CTV directly, and this is worth repeating precisely, we are sharing after Canada is paid back. We get the revenues, then the servicing of the costs of the bridge and paying the debt of the bridge, and then what's left over. There's a split of that for 15 years. In other words, operating costs and debt servicing come off the top before any splitting happens at all. Carney has gone out of his way publicly to downplay how much money will actually flow through this fund in the near term, suggesting profits in the first years could be minimal once expenses are paid, a claim he made specifically to diffuse domestic criticism that Canada had given away the store. That single word, net, not gross, is the difference between a headline that reads, Canada gave away half its bridge money, and a messier reality where nobody outside the negotiating room yet knows how much money there will actually be to split. No governance structure for the fund has been made public. No projections have been published showing what 15 years of net profit sharing could realistically total, unlike, for comparison, the traffic and toll figures Canada has published for the crossing itself. The Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority described the new terms only as a series of cooperative measures related to how tolls would be charged, language that tells you almost nothing about who actually controls the money or how it eventually gets spent. That vagueness is already generating friction inside Canada. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation called the arrangement deeply frustrating for the people who finance the entire project, with its national director noting plainly, Taxpayers paid to build the bridge, and now it looks like they're losing out on some of the profit. Conservative critic Shuvaloy Majumdar sent an open letter to Canada's Intergovernmental Affairs Minister demanding the government release the full agreement, with a complete accounting of costs, before the bridge opens to traffic. As of this recording, the full legal text has not been made public, and that letter has not received a response. Majumdar also argued the government's own wait-and-see posture over the past several months created the vulnerability that let Washington cherry-pick a finished, high-value asset as a pressure point. Not everyone in Canada sees it as a loss, though, and it's worth including that side too. Business groups and trade experts, including Carleton University's Fen Osler-Hampson, have argued Carney essentially had no better option, leaving a fully built, billion-dollar bridge sitting closed and unused indefinitely would have made it what he called a stranded asset, with the corridor's economic value to both countries far outweighing the cost of the concession. The busiest land border crossing in North America carries hundreds of millions of dollars in trade every single day, and a fourth crossing between these two cities directly benefits the auto manufacturing ecosystem that ships parts back and forth across this exact border multiple times during a single vehicle's assembly. Watch how differently the governments involved talked about the exact same deal, because it tells you almost as much as the terms themselves. Trump's statement was personal and victorious, framed entirely in the first person. I secured a much better deal for America. Governor Whitmer's statement, released the same week, didn't mention Trump once. Thousands of Michigan workers built this critical bridge, which will speed up auto production, lower costs, ease traffic, strengthen agriculture, and give people on both sides of the border better paying jobs and brighter futures, she said, crediting workers, not politics. Carney's language was measured almost to the point of downplaying Canada's own win, insisting publicly there isn't much profit worth fighting over in the first place. 3 governments, 3 completely different messaging strategies describing one signed agreement. There's a bigger backdrop here too, and it explains why Canada may have felt it had limited room to push back harder. This bridge dispute didn't happen in isolation. It landed in the middle of the broader Canada-US trade relationship at its most fragile point in years. That July 1st CUSMA review deadline came and went without an extension or replacement being finalized, leaving the agreement in an uncertain holding pattern rather than the predictable multi-year renewal cycle businesses had planned around for the past decade. In the months before the bridge deal closed, Canada had already rescinded its digital services tax and ordered its broadcast regulator to review a decision that would have tripled streaming companies' financial contributions to Canadian content. 2 policies Washington had publicly objected to. Critics point to a pattern, concession after concession, with the bridge simply being the most visible one because, unlike tax policy, you can put a ribbon on it. Carney has responded to that pressure with a pivot analysts are calling significant. In roughly the same window as this bridge dispute, Canada and China announced a preliminary agreement to roll back tariffs both countries imposed in 2024, including a deal allowing Canada to import Chinese electric vehicles at a sharply reduced rate. Carney has said openly and repeatedly that Canada's economic dependence on the United States has become a strategic weakness, and that diversifying trade partnerships is now a priority, not an option. Trump's hockey comment, bizarre as it sounded, was actually a direct reaction to that exact pivot toward Beijing. A warning shot about the Stanley Cup wrapped around a real policy grievance. So where does that leave the actual bridge? The one people in Windsor and Detroit have been waiting years to drive across. It opens July 27th. It becomes the 4th crossing connecting these 2 cities, easing pressure on both the Ambassador Bridge and the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel. Tolls are set at up to $10 per car and $20 per axle for commercial trucks. For a manufacturing corridor this dense, a faster, less congested crossing carries genuine economic value, regardless of who ends up profiting from the tolls that pay for it. It's worth remembering who this bridge was actually built for in the first place, because that part of the story tends to get lost once the politicians start talking. Windsor and Detroit have functioned almost as sister cities for generations, with residents crossing the river constantly for work, shopping, and family. Windsor's population sits around 230,000 people, and like Detroit, its economy leans heavily on manufacturing and the auto industry specifically. For decades, nearly all of that traffic funneled through one aging, privately owned bridge. A public 4th crossing was never really a luxury project. It was capacity the region needed regardless of which government eventually took credit for opening it. But the financial story underneath the ribbon-cutting ceremony is not the simple victory lap either government wants you to see. Canada built this bridge alone, financed it alone, and now shares 50% of net profits for 15 years with a fund that has no published governance rules, no named projects, and no public accounting yet. Whether that arrangement quietly extends Canada's original 50-year repayment runway even further, nobody outside these negotiations currently knows for certain. And that includes most of the people currently cheering this deal as a clean American win or a clean Canadian one. Zoom out for a second, because this bridge is really a case study in something much bigger than Windsor and Detroit. Infrastructure deals like this rarely dominate a news cycle for more than a week, but they establish patterns that shape how future negotiations get conducted. Notice the sequence here. Build the asset completely, get it fully operational and ready for use, and only then apply pressure. Because at that point, the side that paid for it has the most to lose by walking away, and the side applying pressure has nothing invested and therefore nothing to lose. That is a fundamentally different negotiating position than arguing over a project that's still on paper. Once something is built, finished, and sitting there unused, its owner becomes desperate to generate revenue from it. And that desperation is exactly the leverage the other side needs. This is not a one-time dynamic specific to a single bridge. Canada and the United States share pipelines, rail crossings, and increasingly interconnected energy grids along this same border, many of them financed disproportionately by one side or the other. If a completed, revenue-generating asset can become a bargaining chip after the fact, regardless of who financed its construction, that is a precedent worth watching closely on every future cross-border project, not just this one. The pattern here wasn't really about fairness or about who built what. It was about who held leverage at the moment leverage mattered most, which was the moment right before the asset opened and started generating value. That's also the lesson for anyone trying to read past a celebratory press release on this story or any other, whenever an announcement gets framed purely as a win. Much better deal, great and fair, take your pick. The more useful question isn't who's claiming victory. It's simpler than that. Who actually paid for this? Who actually profits from it going forward? And who controls the money once it starts flowing? On the Gordie Howe Bridge, the answers are genuinely mixed. Canada paid for all of it. The profit-sharing structure now favors the US earlier than originally planned, and control over the fund holding America's share remains, as of this recording, undefined. Two of those three questions currently have no clean answer, and that's usually where the real financial risk in any deal like this is quietly sitting. Here's what to actually watch for going forward. Watch for the full agreement text, which conservative critics in Ottawa are actively demanding be released before or shortly after the July 27th opening. Right now, the public has a summary of terms, not the underlying legal document. Watch for the first public reporting on what net toll revenue actually looks like once the bridge has been operating for a full year, since that single figure will finally test whether Carney's not much profit to split framing holds up against Trump's much better deal framing. Watch for who ends up governing that regional development fund and what specific projects it ends up financing on the American side of the border. A crown corporation with no published rules is not the same thing as a crown corporation with an independent audit trail. And watch the broader CUSMA relationship closely, because the exact leverage dynamic that shaped this bridge deal. A finished, valuable asset held hostage until the smaller economy conceded ground, is now the operating template for the entire trade relationship between these two countries at exactly the moment that relationship is up for its own renegotiation. Because here's the real lesson buried under the fireworks and the flags at that ribbon-cutting ceremony. It wasn't the country that paid for the bridge that wrote the final terms. It was the country with the leverage to keep it closed. Canada built it. Canada financed it. Every dollar for 7 straight years. And Canada still had to negotiate for the right to open something it already owned outright. Whatever side of this you land on, a pragmatic concession that finally got a needed bridge open, or a taxpayer-funded asset quietly handed away one word at a time. Both readings can be true at once, depending entirely on how that fund gets governed over the next 15 years. That's precisely why the fine print matters more than the flag waving at any ribbon cutting. The headline says, America won a much better deal. The fine print says, Canada gave up a guaranteed, if slow, path to full repayment in exchange for a fund nobody has fully explained yet. Numbers rarely lie, even when the press conference around them sounds completely convincing. I'm Connor Mackenzie. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the fine print behind the headlines on Canada U.S. trade, subscribe to Canada Plus 24, and I'll see you in the next one.